either have been torn up or are part of little freight systems that could be reconnected for $1 billion or so. So mass transit is there. Buses have been sort of, in a sense, relegated to moving lower income workers around in sort of excruciatingly long and disconnected routes, like most of the world, where they'll spend an hour and a half getting to work to get a minimum wage job. So not very effective. We want to fix that. We want to change that. Not a huge constituency for that around the state, but we're trying to do it. And interestingly, as often happens, as more people who are having higher wage jobs want to use the bus to travel maybe 2 miles and not 5 miles to a job, we may develop a constituency, because as upper middle class people want to use the bus and want it to be convenient, we actually will be able to get some sway up at the state capitol. So we're very excited about the juxtaposition of 2 constituencies that want bus transit. Again, I talked about competition for talent. If you're a small city like New Haven, it's got to work, and so people have got to be able to get here. And oftentimes, when the hospital or the university is negotiating for a top professor or a top surgeon or whatever, where their parking lot spaces is very important. And I often get, senior administrators who say, I've got to have a space right here, got to be across the street, it's got to be this or that. So the idea of VIP parking and an entitled, population that wants parking is very, very important. Weather is obviously an issue. You can walk a few blocks. Can you walk 5 blocks, 10 blocks in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the winter? Where do we put spaces? When do we need to have a shuttle bus, and all of that stuff becomes very important. How often is the shuttle bus run? So all of these things sort of work into the idea of satellite parking lots and things like that. The culture, we'll get into that for a while. We think of ourselves as a very eco-friendly place, and everybody wants to be eco-friendly, and they want to go to the vegan restaurant, but they do want to park right in front. And so we have to sort of figure out what that culture is. At the same time, one of the important parts of our culture is that this is a city like Cambridge and other places where the politics, are truly egalitarian. We really do have a lot of people who are not Yaleys who actually run the town. And so they are beginning to realize, and the mayor has been very eloquent about this, that transportation is a civil rights issue. If you are going to a lower wage job, your time is actually much more valuable than somebody who's going to a higher wage job, because you got to get there and start earning your money very quickly, and you probably have childcare issues or whatever. So the culture of New Haven, I think, is shifting to a point where transportation is going to be a real issue. And so the ubiquity of transportation is now going to compete with other issues which have sort of influenced our transportation thinking. And so I think that's actually a very positive thing. Safety is an issue. For a lot of people who don't know the city well, they see parking and where they park and the juxtaposition of parking, whether it's to their job at the hospital or Yale or coming in to see the theater or whatever, as something which will have an impact on whether they actually come into the city. If they have to walk too far, if it's too dark, if it's too weird, they don't want to do it anymore. And we do lots of surveys, and they say that safety and parking are key determinants of whether they come or not. Now, we've actually sort of dived a little bit deeper there, and what we realize is that some of the people, and this may be a New England phenomena, simply don't like cities. And so the fact that they have to go to theater or nice restaurants in cities, they find an affront in itself. They really want to stay out in the suburbs and in the mall. And so one of the things that we're beginning, as we get to this issue more and more, is to say, can you ever win people over who are just sort of freaked out by cities and sidewalks and parking garages? And that's going to be, I think, an interesting part of our cultural discussion right now, is who is our audience? And as the country becomes more comfortable at the young end and the older end with cities and density and things like that, do we really want to be fighting for 45-year-old people who live in the suburbs and just have told us we don't like cities? And so that's going to have an impact on parking and how we set up parking. And it may have an influence on the policies of universities and hospitals as they basically sort of change their policies of trying to minister to that middle age and that middle sort of view that everything's got to be close, convenient, cheap, and whatever. And then finally, the town gown issue. We have people who live in downtown and walk to lower wage jobs, and it's it's actually pretty convenient. They can work in restaurants, they can work at Yale, they can do all sorts of things. As cities become more popular, middle class and upper middle class people want to be able to walk to those jobs as well. And so we're dealing with both parking issues and housing issues in terms of who lives where and who has a right to the convenient job. And does a population that was kind of stuck living in downtown for 40 years now get displaced to an outer ring of the inner city so that richer people, quite frankly, can live closer to downtown? And the answer is probably not. There's going to be some real political pushback. But again, going higher up to the transportation options, if that does become the reality, just because real estate developers own land and want to change the use of land, then the bus issue and that last mile or last 2 mile issue will become even more of a political issue. Because if I'm moving a lower wage population, lower income population out of the convenient walkable space to a place where they're now having to stay on a bus for 30 minutes and wait an hour for that bus, now suddenly the politics change. So that's sort of a quick overview, and I hope I didn't repeat everything you talked about this morning, but that's just sort of a start. So you know, here we are in New Haven, and so that is our paradigm. That's our downtown bike place where I used to see Doug when he was a politician, before he became a bureaucrat, sort of hanging out all the time. Right now, actually, we've converted this into our World Cup headquarters. We have TVs out there, and there were apparently 900 people out there Sunday night watching the game. But this has become the sort of center of downtown, and it's not sort of surprising that it's a bike shop, and that people just hang out there, and it's very convenient, and that's sort of, I think, a paradigm. Downtown, cafe, plaza, bike shop.
Grocery store.
And grocery store, right, and a co-op right around the corner.
Bar.
At a bar, right. And of course, this is us, you know, this is me, you know, exactly. And so, you know, and I will confess, my family, we have 7 Priuses. I have a Prius, my wife has a Prius, my daughter has a Prius, my mother has a Prius, my sister and my brother. So, you know, there we are. We are it. And my wife is a professor at the forestry school. So, and in fact, of the first 5 Priuses sold in Connecticut in 2003, all 5 of them went to forestry school professors. So, you know, I think that's the other sort of cultural power that universities have. And if you walk out on any street here, you will see a lot of Priuses. And that's probably true of all of our communities, just because of who we are. So a little history. So here's Yale. Here's Yale at the end of the 19th century. You know, a lot of those buildings are still here. The green is still there. The churches are still there. I mean, a few of them are gone. No cars, obviously, before the car was invented. And it was sort of a very convenient little place. And, you know, we didn't worry about parking that much. I mean, interestingly, when you go and you read the Times there, you did worry about horse manure. And of course, in those days, the real political issue was making the streets safe for bicycles, which, as some of you know, was the first big advocacy group for hardened streets and for having lanes and having intersections, because the horses were pretty lethal. And the bicyclists were saying, we don't want to run through mud, shit, and we don't want to be run over. And so they became real advocates here, and New Haven was a center of bicycling from the 1870s. And I'm sure Holly's already talked about this, or somebody has. But the other thing was, I mean, bicycles were invented here, and the largest center for bicycle manufacturing in the country was Hartford, not New Haven. We were rifles and other things. One quick historical side note. Does anybody know why the bicycle industry in Hartford went out of business? Great story. Because they actually put all of their money betting on the future in 1908, and the future was electric cars. And the Pope Manufacturing Company converted their manufacturing to electric cars and went out of business. So here we are. You know, Tesla, where are you? You know, and but transportation was certainly a huge issue for us back then, and it was, you know, going back to the history of Yale. Just if I can go all the way back to the history of Yale. Yale was founded in Branford, but it moved to Old Saybrook very quickly, and then camped out there for about 15 years. Now, why would you, Connecticut historians, why would you move to Old Saybrook if you were starting a university? Any thoughts? because it was really the center point of the transportation system for the state. Why? Because the only navigable river was the Connecticut River, and if you had to get from Hartford to New Haven back and forth because you really weren't sure where you wanted to be, you would be in Old Saybrook. That was the middle point of the state, just from a standpoint of transportation systems. They then had a competition, a bake-off between Hartford and New Haven to see who would offer the most money. And New Haven, amazingly, because we rarely win these things, won the competition, and they moved here, which was sort of made sense because they were they were a zealot school and still sort of very conservative. And New Haven was seen as a much more conservative place even in 1700. And so the history actually sort of worked out. They would have been unhappy in the much more sort of progressive Hartford at the time. So here's New Haven a little bit later. Again, not a lot of parking, a lot of cars, still very much a trolley town. I ran the Chamber of Commerce for 13 years, and that was our building right next to City Hall. I'm now in City Hall. So over the last 120 years, institutionally, I've moved literally about 100 feet, which is sort of, I think, typical of a lot of people in New England. But you know, there we were, and it was very much trolleys, an elaborate trolley system. And in fact, we are, and one of our big projects now is getting a hold of one of the big trolley garages, which are very valuable and are in very key positions within the city and have been just laid to waste for the last 30 years, literally just rotting there. So trolleys were important, horses not so much, cars becoming. And here we are a few years later, not a great picture, but sort of, it's important to see this because, you know, there's the harbor, and the harbor goes right up to the railroad tracks. You know, one of the myths of New Haven, just from a transportation standpoint, is that the highway cut us off from the water. And a lot of people sort of are so angry about that. Goddamn highway, separate us from the water. But as you can see from this picture, it didn't at all. In fact, what the highway did is it built a whole new community for us, which is the Longworth community, those of you who know New Haven. And in fact, the water at this point, the port on both sides of the harbor was totally industrial. A lot of mud, railroads, slaughterhouses, and all sorts of things. And the city was very much centered around its trolley system and around the downtown. So we were the classic sort of hub and spoke, if you can be that, you know, obviously not a perfect circle being on the water, but we were very much a system that brought people right to the center of downtown. And our parking at that point was really not a big issue because most people lived within the trolley system, and in fact, the neighborhoods that were the densest in the 20s and 30s before the war were all connected to the trolley. So if you were in West Haven or East Haven or Hamden, you were taking a trolley, and that was the way things worked. And so here was the sort of ultimate multimodal system. There's the trolley right in front of our train station, picking people up, and there were tracks everywhere, and you know, there were cabs and a few cars or whatever, but this is how people worked. When they came up to the Yale Bowl to go to games, they would take the train from Manhattan, they would get on this trolley, and they actually had special Yale Bowl, Harvard, the game trolleys that sort of would be open with big banners and things, and there would be a whole fleet of them. It was a whole parade. It was like when the circus would come into town, and the elephants would come in, when all the big rich Yaleys would come in from New York, they would get on the trolleys, and people would come and wave to them. It was actually a very big deal. But of course the trolleys ended, and then we sort of had to sort of get serious about becoming part of the future. And so here was New Haven after the war, sort of a dense place. Right down there in the lower center is the hospital. The various wings of the hospital have been growing there. As you can see in this picture, if you can make it out, there is no parking anywhere. And so the trolleys now are gone, the buses are coming in, and the streets are getting absolutely, totally congested. My stepfather told me that they would go to the Yankee Stadium on Sundays, and 5 hours to get from New Haven to the Bronx, you know, on a bad day. And that was pretty typical going along Route 1. So when the war was over and people started thinking about, you know, how are we going to sort of deal with the future, they got very, very creative. And this highway department had as its leader a guy named Maurice Rodeval, who sort of spent his time in New Haven and Paris hanging out with Corbusier and other people, and then was here at planning school and worked for the city. I think he had Doug's job, so Doug's got big shoes to fill. And he said, you know, the city now is a transportation center. It's not a labor center anymore. It's really a transportation center. we've got to figure out ways to get people in and out. So they had this whole elaborate plan for radial highways connecting up and down the coast and up to Hartford and to Waterbury and all sorts of things. Amazingly, this was 1946, pretty much came to pass one way or another, by hook or by crook. And as part of it, there was sort of an elaborate sort of destruction of what was in its path, because that was seen as pretty low value. There were people in its path, but the value wasn't seen there. And so all of these highways went right through communities. And you know, it took a while for it to sort of get traction. And in the meantime, the state was sort of picking up on a lot of these ideas. This is an early picture of the Merritt Parkway. It's kind of cute in terms of how we did exit ramps and signage and things like that. And anyway, so that's the Merritt Parkway somewhere. I think, I'm not sure exactly where. But you know, the state in the 20s and 30s was building its own system, which actually didn't connect to New Haven, actually didn't connect to any cities, ironically. And so the city was very interested in sort of having a connection to all of this, and again, was willing to demolish anything in its way, and this is sort of the rubble of where the Route 34 area ended up going in. That's the phone company building, which now ironically is 300 George Street, is very much a part of the Yale innovation community. In fact, it may well be its epicenter. So here we are in 1958, destroying a neighborhood, building a utility office switching building, which is now the head of the Center of Biotech for New Haven. So, you know, in our lifetime. So these things sort of change a lot. So here's the dream. A dream comes true. And so here's our mayor standing on the corner of an office building that had been built for the Yale Medical School, overlooking his new world, which is this amazing highway, which is really an exit ramp off of another amazing highway, the 95 filling in at the harbor. There's that building that was under construction over on the left. And so the Maurice Rodeval dream had come true in terms of connecting New Haven to the modern world. And they really thought that this was the winner, that they had sort of aced it, that the suburbs were not going to compete with us, that we would not have malls, we would not have the kind of sprawl, or if we did have sprawl, we would still be the epicenter. It might not have been the green, but it would be damn close, and that we would figure out how to make this all work. And so as part of that, we had these elaborate plans, and there is Dick Lee in his sort of favorite position. He had these elaborate models, which I'm sure are in one of the sub-basements, the catacombs somewhere, and Doug and I will find them someday. But there are all these great models of what was going to happen, and you can see over on the left-hand side some of the Le Corbusier instigated and inspired high-rise buildings that were filling in, actually on both sides, for what had been, you know, in those days considered sprawl and tenements. Now would be considered Brooklyn, but you know, then in those days was just sort of to be gotten rid of, and there was the highway that we're now, as we'll tell you in a little bit, getting rid of. And here was a sort of great introduction of the world of parking. David Panagor, who's here, is our wonderful executive director of the Parking Authority, and oversees this, literally this work of art. If the 13th century had cathedrals, New Haven had parking garages. And this was our great monument. Dean of the Yale Architecture School, Paul Rudolph, amazing sort of new elements of poured concrete. He designed it from scratch. There wasn't a single parking engineer in the room. And if you go in there, it is an inspiring garage. Now, many people hate it because it's unlike any parking garage. But if you actually think about how it works, it was done by an artist in terms of the internal, both stairways and access ramps. And as David was telling me last night, they've moved the exit ramp from one area to another, totally switchable, bi-directional lanes. You can go up, you can go down, you can go over any one of 3 different streets to exit. An absolutely amazing structure done by an artist, which was going to again be seen as the epitome of New Haven's contribution to the modern world. The car to downtown. And off to the right were brand new mall stores. I mean, with 2 department stores and a mall. And this was all happening in the early 60s. And we were very comfortable and confident that, again, we were going to beat the future. The future would play to our drummer, and that all of this would sort of, that people would fall in love with it. Didn't work out that way, but this was our dream, and it was all about the car. And of course, where that parking garage had been, and where those department stores had been 150 different businesses. And they all sort of picked up and moved. Some of them moved to the suburbs, some of them moved a little bit around the corner. But an entire 100 years of downtown was just sort of wiped out. And we started from scratch, and it was all for the car and all for parking. And so from that point, Lee sort of said, you know, we want to make sure at the micro scale, not just the macro scale, that this all works. So that green highway right in the middle was the Route 34 connector. And that was going to, you saw him standing up looking at the dream. Well, that was just the first 3 blocks of that. Dick Lee was going to continue that all the way to the suburbs, and then was going to force the state to create a limited access road all the way to Newtown, Connecticut. And that was very important for him, because he knew that people were moving to the suburbs. He knew that he couldn't keep people living in the city, but he expected them to work here, he expected them to commute here. And with the I-95 corridor along the coast, and with the Route 34 corridor going up through the spine of the state, he really expected that we would maintain our dominance over the labor market and the industrial markets. And that was his opinion. And down there you can see the old Route 1, which again was 2 lanes. A few places it was 4 lanes, was bumper to bumper, limited access, and that was very much the past. So you have the new parking garages and new highways. And here was the harbor, and you can see the great Q Bridge, the Pearl River Memorial Bridge, and the interchange. And all of that land that you see there had once been industrial, and now it was being reborn. And you can see our construction from the 80s, the office towers there, other kinds of uses, and whatever. And so we were very much, we felt, positioned for all of this. This was, again, another great contraption. This is our Coliseum. I hope some of you remember it, a blessed memory. It had the 2,400 spaces up top. Coliseum, really the first big arena in the state, way before Hartford or Bridgeport or anything else. This was where every rock and roll show played in the 70s. This, too, was brilliantly designed as a parking facility. Now, amazingly, the thing cost about $12 million, and they ran out of money at the end, because in those days there was no state help, which, again, for those of us in Connecticut, is sort of almost mind-boggling that the city would bond for it itself, would design it itself, would do it without any state help. They came up about $4 million short. The $4 million was going to build an exhibition hall here, actually what they built up in Hartford. They wanted a convention center. They actually had plans for a convention center right where those trees are. And the other thing, which ended up being its sort of tragic downfall, again from the standpoint of parking, was if you see those helixes here, they were supposed to be enclosed, and they weren't enclosed. And they had designed a whole special lighting system, and they were perfect circles. And so instead of having this sort of internal sort of World's Fair kind of ride with very well-marked things that people would feel comfortable going up to the top, people would drive around and see the city spinning around and hated it. And it just became this thing of sort of ridicule and derision. But interestingly, and I can say this as a former commissioner of this wonderful building, in those helixes were 4 interconnected lanes, almost like a DNA. And they connected up to 2 different platforms, and there were 2 of these things, which meant that after a show, you actually had 8 lanes that could all be operated simultaneously, emptying out onto unique roads, each with their own assigned lane. It was actually the most brilliant garage ever built. You could actually unload 2,400 spaces in about 20 minutes if you had the right police overtime. And it was just brilliant. People hated it, and it was torn down, and with it, those 2,400 spaces. But this was sort of our call to the future, because those spaces were both built for entertainment, obviously, when there would be big events, but they also were where everybody parked. So as Doug now tries to figure out where to put City Hall employees and other kinds of employees, the availability of parking was never an issue for New Haven because we always had these 2,000 spaces literally just floating there within eyesight of everybody in town, and really just a couple blocks from everybody. They're gone now, and we'll see that that has consequences. So here are some of the other things. So that Route 34 connector ended up being a parking catchment area, and one of David's biggest projects is sort of this air rights garage, as we call it, very unceremoniously. What a stupid name, but it was the air rights over this highway because Dick Lee and the other people in New Haven, all of us, said there's going to be a highway there, it's going to Newtown, and so we'll build over it. The highway never went beyond the parking garage. But that's another 2,400 or 2,000 spaces or whatever, and that ended up fueling the development of the medical center, which very much needed a lot of parking, and as it filled in all those surface lots that we saw on the first slide, they needed parking, and so this, sadly sort of somewhat ugly project, which ended up blocking the medical school literally, visually, and operationally from downtown, is our legacy of sort of having to think about parking and the role of institutions needing parking. So that was the legacy of all of that work back in the 50s to build this highway. That's a little bit of sort of history. So where are we going in the future? Where are we now? So right now we have a $2.5 billion project to make sure that the highways are still there. This is the sort of most dramatic piece of it. We're rebuilding the Q Bridge, but the highways are being built all the way to Branford and all the way to West Haven, and then there'll be parts of it going up to Hamden and North Haven. So here we are 60 years later, and making sure that there are enough lanes and enough exits and whatever is still very much job one for the state and the federal government when it comes to cities. And when they built the first bridge, we lost about 15,000 jobs and about 200 companies, and this has taken fewer jobs and fewer companies, but still has taken a huge amount of land, and is making it sort of a challenge to figure out how to sort of create industrial space in the city. But again, it is a nice thing to have. I was actually walking there last week. It's pretty dramatic when you're up there. It's going to be, I don't know, 12 lanes as opposed to 4 lanes or 6 lanes. I mean, it's a huge improvement, and it's still about getting people here so they can do one thing, which is park. So that's still a big issue. So here's our sort of, this is what people want. This is our 100% block. This is the British Art Museum with lovely shops underneath it. This is where most people are headed, sort of to within a block or two of this building. It's right across the street from here. This is what people want. They just want to be right on the street, and there are only 14 spaces there, and there are probably 500 people a day coming that want to be in those 1,400 spaces. So therein lies, our fundamental challenge that Doug and all of you have. How do we meter this? Is it long-term, short-term? Do we charge all day? Do we charge on the weekends? How do we deal with this? People are always coming to David and saying, can't they be free? Can't we have discounts? Can't we do other things? And it's all about this real estate right here. And how do we deal with that so that we can get people from the suburbs who are used to free parking going into our lovely little shops here? And so that has been the paradigm. Yale has built all sorts of garages everywhere. Once upon a time, Yale basically piggybacked on our system or had surface lots. But as they've come into a lot of money over the last 15 years and have spent close to $1 billion, probably more than $1 billion, on new construction, they just didn't have surface spaces anymore. So they built a whole network of truly beautiful garages for their own account, in their own system. They're secret, I don't know how they really work. Maybe somebody here does. I'm just kidding, but I mean, so we now have 2 big garage systems in town, our system and Yale's system. So clearly there are all sorts of different price considerations, who gets what the VIP treatment is. I don't know what it all is. I actually do because my wife is there, but the truth is, it's a huge part of, again, the culture. Where do you park? How close to your building do you park? Each building still has a few VIP spaces for executives. For I get to park right next to my office, but my employees don't. My wife gets to park right next to her office, but her postgrads don't. So these are still big issues in a town like this. Here is our connection to the world, which is the train station. and our little shuttle bus. This is David's World down at the train station. That garage is full by 7:30. We've been trying for 15 years to get another one built, basically so we can import people who need heavy rail to go someplace, and this is the end of the line for a lot of trains. And so we're worrying about people from the suburbs so they can commute to other jobs. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's still what we're doing. And it's going to get more complicated soon because in the future, oh, I just threw this in. This is Le Corbusier's model that Rodeval, when he was over in Paris on those trips, would come back with. And there are many drawings of New Haven that look just like this. And in fact, we do have a couple buildings that actually were built like this. If you know 100 York Street or any of the towers, we actually started on a grid that was supposed to go all the way to the water of big towers like this. Didn't happen, thank goodness. But it is interesting, again, to see the paradigm of what people expected to live in and like back in 1955. And you know, I don't think they had cars in these pictures. They probably had air tubes, right, that you would get in and just sort of zip off to other places, or monorails. But the point was that they were very self-contained, dense cities that we're actually coming to, because ironically, we're actually building things that just look like it. So this is our big pharmaceutical building. It's a $200 million building. It started off as one office in Science Park, one of my early projects. They went out to the suburbs, and then they realized they couldn't hire people in the suburbs. Again, because of that two-occupation couple issue, that it was likely that people working at a big pharmaceutical company might have a spouse in Boston, or might have a spouse at NYU or Columbia. They didn't need to be on the train line. They needed to be in a much denser, more fun place to live, and so they are locating a couple blocks from here, and it's very exciting. And I think there'll be 2 or 3 of these buildings if it all goes according to plan. And then I hope the tide will turn and we'll actually be able to go up to Cambridge and northern New Jersey and actually recruit people who didn't go to graduate school here and didn't start their company at Yale, but actually want to move here, just like the rest of the world. But right now, we're sort of relying on Yale grads who make good. This company's worth $40 billion, so that's pretty good. We actually had 4 companies that went public in the last 15 years, all for $1 billion. This is the only one that's still in business. That was a lot of money that was spent here in biotech. In fact, Doug came here to work for one of those companies. When he was an undergrad, he was a biotech guy, and he decided that parking was a much better future. So I think that's good testimony to where we're going. Here's the streetscape. This is actually all a platform over Route 34. So this is almost exactly where Dick Lee was standing when he looked out over A Dream Comes True. And now this platform will be there in about a year, and it will be a cafe, and it will be a high-tech center, and it will look somewhat like Kendall Square in Cambridge if we get everything right. So we're very excited about that. This is another parking lot, which is becoming housing, again, just a few blocks from here. And we've got 5 more of these, not in the planning, I mean, actually about to start. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And I'll take full credit for it. Actually, the mayor will take full credit for it, but it's not us, because this is happening in small cities across New England and the Hudson Valley. So we're going to have 5 projects, each with about 250 apartments, all comparable design, I mean, different architecture, but the same basic idea. And so we're going to have thousands of new people, high-end people, coming to work at Alexion. And the interesting thing is that the parking ratios, let's get the parking, I know that was my assignment here, the parking ratio for these kinds of housing used to be, you know, 2 spaces, 1.5 spaces per apartment if you were like really out there and you had like old people who couldn't drive anymore. But now the standard is 0.75, and they're figuring that even at 0.75 per apartment, they're going to have extra spaces, and they're going to be renting them out to other people who live around the corner. So the truth is that when people move into a $3,000 a month 2-bedroom in a year, that the expectation is that they're not going to have a lot of cars. And so those couples coming here are going to be using transportation, are going to be using other things. So that is the paradigm shift. Because if you had to have 2 spaces per unit here, you couldn't build these buildings. The water table's too high. We would be totally freaked out by 3 layers of parking, you know, that would just block off the street. I require, you know, restaurants and retail. It'd be easy for me to say that, but developers have been pretty good about this. And so if the parking ratios were different, we wouldn't have this renaissance, because you'd have to go to a place where you could get $3,500 for that space, for that apartment. And that's really been the difference. The Providences, the Bostons, the White Plainses have been able to build these, even the Norwalks. But when you dipped under $3 a square foot, or $3,000 down to $2,800, the economy, the economics didn't work until the parking changed. So actually parking has had a huge impact on this. Not that anybody outside this room would understand that. And then this is where the Coliseum was, that wonderful monstrosity. And this will be 350 units. It will be a 4- or 5-star hotel, more medical office buildings. And the one requirement that they made, which was in a sense psychotic, but also brilliant, was that the highway had to go away. And so right in front of this project, we are building Orange Street, which doesn't matter what it is because you guys don't know Orange Street, but we're actually reconnecting the highway over the highway, and Route 34 is going to disappear. And there'll actually be just an intersection there, albeit a complicated one because there'll be some special tunnels that will go into that big parking garage. So here's the ironic thing. In 1957, Dick Lee went to the federal government and the state government and begged them to build what was then the longest exit ramp in the history of the interstate highway system. And he was turned down many times until finally the politics were such. And it was actually an interesting story. It wasn't until after Abe Ribicoff was elected governor in 1958, and he was against the project, but the then Commissioner of Transportation, or Secretary of the Bureau of Highways, I think was his title, was a nice, waspy guy who just sort of thought that Dick Lee's idea was interesting, and he approved in the lame duck session, after his boss had been not elected, the highway. So what we fought for in 1957 and 58, we are now begging the state to get rid of. And the state had said to us, are you insane? You can't get rid of that highway. Where will the traffic go? It's not going to work. And so many times I would go up and I would tell the story. And of course, highway engineers being what they are, they would throw me out of the room because they don't like stories like that. I thought it was funny and ironic. They thought I was an asshole. But the point was that we are coming full circle here, and we are filling in. And the only way that this can possibly work is remember that that Coliseum had the parking in the air because the water table is 10 feet from the surface here. It's not going to have a lot of parking because they expect that most of the people who are going to be living here are going to be walking again to Alexion or other pharmaceutical or Yale New Haven. And so the parking issue here has become sort of an interesting issue. And if this were the 1970s or 80s and you needed a parking load for retail and other things, it just wouldn't work. Train station is a block away. Eventually you have 2 train stations, each a block away. And so that's going to happen. I'm not going to show this one. But this is the other side of the Route 34 connector, which was in that vacant field for 50 years where they were going to connect it to Newtown, never did. And we're now developing all sorts of other kind of mixed-use things, the parking garages and scientific buildings and centers for all sorts of biotech and whatever, and even we're going to have some retail out there. So this will then morph into housing and other things for the neighborhood. But again, the issue here, and now to sort of to flip it a little bit and talk about parking again, if you see that parking garage in the middle, the neighbors are fine with having biotech there, they're fine with having restaurants and retail, but they actually said to us, is there any way you could do this without having visible parking? We just don't like parking. We think parking garages are an affront to us. Whereas a generation earlier, we were building bigger, massive parking garages. That was a sign of the future. It was what we were doing. Now people are saying, can you bury this? Can you put it someplace else? You know, we got to work on that. Again, without a metro, without better buses, we actually still need parking. But the developer was able to say, honestly, I can build as little parking as I can get away with, because parking for me is just a cost. It doesn't make me a lot of money. You know, now we have to rent $280 a space a month. So it's sort of an interesting time where parking has now become, can we not have it, instead of we need parking because that's the sign of the future. Doug and Dave have these 2 different empires, our Park New Haven, which we've totally rebranded and all sorts of things. But Dave's challenge is, how do we give it away? In other words, what kind of special deals can we have? How do we incent people to go into these garages? I mean, they're full, but we're trying to figure out how to use them as an attraction. And so the mayor and I are always saying, can't we figure out some more creative ways? The garages are beautiful, they're well maintained, they're good. At the other end is Doug's world, which are meters. And we now have very high-tech meters. We can change the prices on a dime. I think I see Paul Wessel here. I'm sure he sort of dreamed up a lot of these ideas years ago when he was running the department. But the point is, we now have very high-tech meters, and we're trying to figure out what to do with them. And now that we actually can have dynamic pricing in both places, and now that I'm here and both of them are connected and talk to each other again, you know, the issue is, should we be overcharging for surface spaces and undercharging for garage? Should we flip it around? I mean, so now we finally can do these things, and we can have one big mesh, one big system, and these actually can work in tandem. In the past, they literally were fighting with each other and had no relationship, and the prices would be set by one group and one by the other, and we would try to sort of compete with the other. Bizarre, how could that happen in a small city? But now we are actually working together, and we're gonna have a lot of exciting things that we're gonna be doing together on that. And then of course, you know, here's the real future. No cars, no parking. Doug's working on the bike share and zip cars and, you know, as you need it, transportation. Is this really the future? I don't know. My wife made me invest in a zip car, so I hope so. But you know, we'll see. I mean, we've been following the New York bike share program. It's expensive, and you know, it's been fascinating to watch the debate in New York, which is obviously a very dense, very sophisticated place, I think. And they're saying if you don't, in a sense, incentivize and invest in the bike share as if it were an alternative to expanding the Second Avenue subway. In other words, if we don't think of it in terms of the millions and tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that it will eventually cost, it probably won't be viable just as a private standalone operation. Now, that may be too conservative, and others in the room may disagree with me. But it's interesting, because if you think about energy, right, I mean, all of the sort of new energy sources are only viable if we look at them as a way to avoid building another power plant or nuclear energy or whatever. And so ultimately, I think we will think about these new transportation methods as a way to avoid building more parking garages or thinking about using that very valuable space in downtown. And then here's my dream, and I keep telling Dave, we want one of these. I want a totally automated parking garage. Not that I don't love our union, and we'll find places for them within this, but because the real issue is parking garages are just so damn inefficient. And as beautiful as that big garage was back in 1962, 63, if we could store more cars per square foot, we actually, you know, would be much more successful in dealing with the issue and with the public that doesn't want big garages that, you know, as you know, are mostly air and roadways. So that's my presentation. I hope it was valuable, but thank you so much. This was fun. Conversation.
Heated parking spots are becoming increasingly popular, I agree, as you referenced earlier in the presentation. But with the advent of heated parking spaces, you need enforcement. You got to make sure that people are not taking the reserved person's spot. You got to make sure that it's properly cleaned, clear of snow and everything, and that adds up to costs to whoever that's operating that parking. Wouldn't that also drive up the cost of living for the users of the parking?
Matt, could you repeat the question?
Talking about gated parking spaces and the cost of maintaining them, and wouldn't that drive up the cost, you know, the ambient cost of living? So since I have absolutely no idea what a gated parking space is, I'll give you an answer, because that's how I roll here.
Cambridge.
So, is that where you own a parking space and it's associated with? Well, look, as I said earlier, institutions, I think, operate in a de facto gated parking space. I mean, they have signs that say, you know, for faculty, for this, for that. And as parking becomes scarce, you know, I have a deeded parking space right at City Hall. look, the issue here is part of that civil rights issue, because at certain price points in terms of what you're earning or what your implied cost of time is, you'll pay anything for parking, right? I mean, in New York, people pay $7.50 a month for parking and are glad to do it. They pay $250 for a bike spot in some garages. So I don't think cost is necessarily the issue. I think it's a civil rights issue, which is, how do we actually value people's time and discomfort and whatever? And if we're not going to invest in buses or mass transit, which is what more socialist places do, then we've got to figure out how to not, I mean, we're having that issue right now in City Hall. Our lowest paid workers, who tend to be sort of space inspectors, have opted not to buy parking spaces and to use their parking cards, which they use when they're out in the field, inspecting a building for free parking in downtown. And our director of parking has correctly said, that's not right. You can't be taking spaces that citizens need, like to pay their tax bills or to go to a restaurant, because you didn't buy a parking space. And they're saying, well, but we can't afford a parking space, and if we had a parking space, you would make us walk 5 blocks to that parking space, and then you make me go to the office in between each visit and write up a report. I'm just saying that because we're dealing with it right now. And they're saying, so if I got to walk 20 minutes back and forth to my parking space, it's cheap, but it's way away, that's not fair. So there's an equity issue within City Hall that we have to deal with. And Doug will solve this tomorrow afternoon, because I've required him to do that. Yes.
I just have a general question. What you're talking about, I'm from Boston, and the same kind of scenario seems to be going on there.
I'm from the Bronx, what can I say?
They're building more and more areas, bringing in younger graduates to work in new businesses, attracting new businesses to the downtown area, which seems to be the same thing you're doing here.
Absolutely.
As time goes on, those younger employees will get to be a little bit older employees, and they will reach an age where they start having children. Then they're going to move away to the suburbs, but they're not going to want to give up their good-paying jobs, which means that now they're in the suburbs and they're driving back to the city for their jobs. So now there's a pressure on the garages that weren't built to support these people who were not going to have cars, who now have cars. So is it the same thing with the former mayor in the 50s who saw this great vision coming around and biting you later on, and that you're going to need a lot more garages in the future?
So it's a great question. So the fundamental question is 1989 going to repeat itself all over again? In other words, those of us who were baby boomers all lived in the city, and then most of us, I didn't, but a lot of people ended up going out to the suburbs. All the condos bottomed out and went out of, people lost their shirts, and the suburbs went through a huge, renaissance in the mid-90s. So here's the interesting thing. I think that, and this may be totally wishful thinking, but I think that the people who went through this the first time in the 80s had grown up in a car culture, because they, in fact, had often grown up in the suburbs. I think that more and more of the kids that we're seeing have a little bit more of an urban background, and cars seem to be less important culturally, which means that there may, in fact, be pressure to actually build some of those mass transit systems, or that at least what will happen, and I think it's actually happening in the Boston area, like along Route 9 and the Newton and Brookline corridors, I think what we'll see is sort of a middle density that will grow up. And I think people may well go to the suburbs, but they won't go to the classic Connecticut suburb, which is 2.5 acres, 12 miles away on a cul-de-sac. I think they will go to former sort of streetcar highway, arterials, and that they will move into attached housing, or they will move into, if it's a single family house, it'll be much more like the Oxford model, where they will be on a dense little road right off of a bus line. So that's our hope, because we've developed all the parking lots. In other words, and we're not about to tear down all the buildings the way they did in the 50s and 60s. So for New Haven, this is actually a gut check, because if we're wrong, then everyone's going to go to Boston, where that infrastructure is in place, and they may have to live literally, as they do now, as you know, in Worcester, but they'll take the T into Boston. And so, I think that the world will change a little bit in terms of proclivities, but we got to monitor that. So it's a great question, but we're certainly hoping that density and transportation systems will evolve with a culture change, and that Doug's generation that sort of grew up on bicycles and zip cars for the weekend. I mean, I'm amazed, when my wife's postdocs say, oh yeah, we went off to, Cape Cod and we don't have a car, oh yeah, we took a zip car. Like, really? It really works? So I'm still culturally amazed by that, but I think that the world will change. And for my mother's generation, she's got a couple more years where she can live in a nice sort of sunny suburban house in Westport, but we're figuring out how she's gonna live in New Haven and where the bus line is that's gonna get her to the museums and to her friends' houses. So that's our world.
We should
Yes.
probably wrap up
Oh, I'm sorry.
soon.
I
We
have
have one
to
more
make
question.
one.
I have the Harvard guys.
First of all, I want to commend you with your choice of architects at Alcus and Freddie for 100 College Ave. They do a wonderful job being from Boston. Well, I have to say though, Bob Stern's up in our neck of the woods all the time and has built some fantastic buildings up at Harvard, both at the Harvard Business School and at the law school. But I also like the brick that you're
He
beginning.
specializes in Disney World.
Well, I like
so
too
it's
that
really-
you're introducing some of the brick as well to this lovely campus and the college area. But I did want to say that I've found, at least over the last 20 years, that there is a much, as you mentioned, a much different culture amongst the millennials relative to how they look at the cars. And the amount of passion there is with the younger students in terms of sustainability and this planet and what it's going to look like in the future, it is something that I believe is changing. And I think we, even though we're in the parking business, it's something that we need to change with that. And the whole idea of this multimodal travel and looking at not just the city as being even car or just rail, but the whole multimodality and providing choice and access that hopefully too, from a pricing perspective, is at different levels will afford that civil rights piece that I think is going to become more and more prevalent, especially at a time when you've got the haves and the have-nots, the 1% and all of that, that is really beginning to stir up amongst a lot of citizens across the country.
Absolutely. Well, maybe one more comment in the back. And then Paul.
Matt, my sister, who is the chair of Harriet Truman Nursing School at Chicago University, Illinois campus, would say that you're making the right bet. Because having worked with her in developing Rush Presbyterian Loop, Cook County Hospital, what they've seen in the last decade is a shift of their, not only the student population moving into the inner city, but they have, like Phil articulated earlier, a whole culture of bicycling, zip cars, shared services, and that has actually grown the city by somewhere close to 40,000-50,000 individuals that were not there 60 months ago. And so what the University of Illinois is doing is that it's continuing, like New Haven, to build intercity, more cost-effective from a housing standpoint, but less parking and more, as John alluded to, intermodal transportation systems that feed the interior, but gives it a very articulate perimeter to work from, and that's been working handsomely.
No, absolutely. And so the final comment is, look, the world at some point, I mean, as you know, Yale is famous for its economics, it's sort of the fiscal side of economics. And at the end of the day, a car costs about $1,200 a month. And if you have a couple, that's $2,400. The developers aren't stupid. They're simply saying, don't pay for the car, pay for your apartment. And that's what's driving Boston, that's what's driving Brooklyn, and that's what's ultimately going to drive New Haven. So it's a simple thing. So I hope all of you have degrees other than just in marketing, because you'll need them eventually. Thank you.